To look at that scripture reading, go ahead also and turn to Psalm 19. The 19th Psalm, we're going to read from there in just a moment, but it's great to see you all today. The Bible tells us that we should be ready to make a defense for the hope that we have within us. Now, last week I began thinking with you about how to make the case for the reasoned hope that we have as Christians. I began last Sunday morning by trying to clear away some of the reasons for doubt that I've heard people talk about, that frankly are some of the reasons that I've had for doubt. And I want you to again understand that if you are a person who struggles with doubt, if you're a person who feels like you're sort of skeptical by nature, then I want you to know that you have come to a welcoming and affirming and friendly place. And I can at least say to you that your preacher this morning is somebody who can sympathize with you, because I've had doubts and I've wrestled with concerns and questions about the faith, just like I know a lot of us have. And I hope that the things we talk about today will be an encouragement to you. And then last Sunday night, I thought I would take a look at sort of the other side of the question here. What if, in fact, there is no God? What if atheism is true? And so we looked at some quotes from atheist philosophers, as well as some of my friends who are atheists. And here's some of the things we talked about last week. If atheism is true, there is no ultimate basis to explain why some things are right or wrong. And for that matter, there's no real basis to explain how we even could make a choice about what is right or wrong. And in fact, as we talked about last Sunday night, it's even hard to account for how we reason about anything, or even how we are conscious of anything. And yet I think all of us understand just intuitively that we have a sense of right and wrong, and that we're able to reflect about things, that we're able to make choices, and that we are aware of all of those things. And by showing that atheism has a lot of terrible consequences, that doesn't prove anything about the existence of God. But maybe, just maybe, by looking at those consequences last Sunday night, it propped the door open just a little bit to make someone who might be skeptical maybe realize, it just seems like there is more to reality than just atoms and molecules. And if you have just at least come that far, then I hope that we can build on that this morning and make the affirmative case for God's existence. Now, I realize since you're here, and this is a church, and we're worshiping, there's a pretty good chance you already believe that God exists. And I think that for most of us here, my guess is, most of us believe that God exists not because somebody has put together some formal step-by-step logical argument. It's just because it makes sense to us. I think a lot of us probably feel the same way that C.S. Lewis did, who said, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. I think just as the sun helps us to make sense of our world physically, I think for most of us there's just that sense that, well, of course God exists. That's how we can explain so much of our world. And yet, I think it's also fair to say that there are some of us for whom faith does not come so easily. And if you're someone who wrestles with these kinds of questions in a more rigorous way, then I hope that the things we talk about this morning can help you see just a basic and fundamental argument for the existence of God. Now, what kind of argument is it going to be? If God was just one more creature in the natural world, maybe we could trace his footprints. Maybe we could get a DNA sample somewhere and we could put these things under a microscope or analyze them in a test tube. But if God exists, he isn't just one more creature in the natural world. And so the tools of science aren't going to help us. And by the way, I think that is one of the underlying problems in the thinking of at least some atheists I have read. They assume that God is just one more physical object in the world that we should be able to study. Richard Dawkins, who wrote a book called The God Delusion, says the existence of God is a scientific hypothesis like any other. Well, no, it's not a scientific hypothesis. There are a lot of things that we believe that just by their nature aren't subject to the tools of science. For example, my mother-in-law is with us here this morning. And I can hypothesize that my mother-in-law loves me. But that's not a scientific hypothesis. I can't prove it by the tools of science. And sometimes, I'm not sure I can prove it by any tool or method here. But nevertheless, I believe it because science just has no bearing on that question. And that's not a flaw of science. It's just the reality of the limits of science. A metal detector is great for finding a married couple's lost wedding ring, but it can't find the love that exists between the married couple because it's just not what a metal detector does. And by the same token, science is able to do a lot, but there's just more to the world. There's more to reality than just simply atoms and molecules. One other thing I want to say about this issue of science before I move on is I think in American culture, this is not true in other cultures, not in England or other cultures in Europe. But in American culture, we've kind of bought into this notion that somehow faith and science or belief in God and science are somehow at war with one another. And the reality is simply this. It is belief in God that gave rise to science. In fact, if you just think about it for a second, there's a common sense reason that that would be the case. Pagan cultures believed in multiple gods, gods that were a part of the natural world. So there's a sun god, a moon god, a rain god, a river god. And so when they looked at reality, what they thought they saw was the chaotic warfare among various gods. Well, how could you possibly make sense of a world that's a battle zone like that? It is the belief that there is one God who is rational, who is the creator of the whole universe, that gave people the ability to say, wait a minute, this world is rational. It's subject to rational laws. It makes sense, and we can actually study it and figure some things out. That's why you have a passage here like Psalm 19. Psalm 19 is a passage that talks about, you might say, the two books of God. One book of God is the written book. That's the book that's described starting at verse 7. The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise the simple. But the psalm starts with another way God has revealed himself. It starts with, you might say, another book that God has written. And it's the book of nature through which we can learn something about God. Verse 1, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. The enterprise of science is only possible if you think the world makes sense and you can study it and make sense of it. And that is only possible if you believe that there is a rational source or creator of the world. There's a sociologist named Rodney Stark who has said the leading scientific figures in the 16th and 17th centuries, that time when science exploded in Europe, were overwhelmingly devout Christians who believed it their duty to comprehend God's handiwork. Someone who studies science is studying nature. And from the point of view of Christianity, they are studying the work of God. They're studying that book of God or revelation of God, just like sometimes we study the written book of God, but it all comes from God. So, science is a good thing. It just doesn't have all the answers. Well, if it doesn't have all the answers, how exactly could we make a case for the existence of God? How could we find him? Well, would you go back with me to our scripture reading this morning in Romans 1? And in fact, I'd like to ask you to mark this passage somehow because I want to come back to it a little bit later today. But I think that Paul gives us the outline here of how to make the case for the existence of God. Romans 1 says this at verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. Well, what truth is it that they are suppressing? Verse 19, what can be known about God? That's the truth that Paul says they are suppressing. Well, what if it isn't clear? Well, he says what can be known about God is plain to them. Well, how has it been made plain? Because God has shown it to them. Well, what has God shown? Verse 20, his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been not just perceived, but clearly perceived. Well, how have they been perceived? Ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. So what Paul is saying is that even though God is invisible, he has made things that are very visible. And if we just simply observe the visible things God has made and use some reason and logic, we can trace our way back to God. And I want to show you how I think you can do that this morning. But first I have to tell you a story. When Christy and I lived in Tennessee, we lived about an hour away from where our congregation assembled. And so we were trying to get our house to put on the market so that we could sell and move closer to our congregation. It was an old house. I loved that house. It was a beautiful old, like 1920 house. It was very charming. Of course, Christy had decorated it beautifully, but it was an old house, you know, so some things didn't work quite right. But we were optimistic we could sell the house pretty quickly. So we put the house on the market, and sure enough, even though it was a small town, in just a couple of months, some people came and looked, and they were so interested, they put a contract down on our house. Unfortunately, that contract was contingent. Now, that's not a word I use a whole lot, contingent. What does that mean? Well, in this case, it meant that they put a contract down on the house, but whether or not they bought the house was going to depend on something else. Namely, it was going to depend on the home inspection. If the home inspection was good, then they would buy the house. But if the home inspection did not go so well, they could back out of the contract. That's what it meant to say it was contingent. It depended on certain things, and unfortunately, as it turned out, because it was an old house, there were a lot of things that the home inspection found. They turned out not to be any big deal, but it was enough that it scared the people off. So they did not buy the house. Which just goes to you to show that something that is dependent may be or may not be, right? It may be the case that we're going to sell our house. It may not be the case that we sold our house. Now, as it turned out, had that contract been approved, we would have sold our house in April and bought another house just a couple of months later, and then when the opportunity to come here arose, it simply would not have been possible because we would have just bought a new house. Which means, if you don't like the preacher, blame it on the couple that voided that contract, all right? But that's what it means to say it was contingent. It depended on certain factors being the case, so that it meant the sale may happen or it may not happen. In other words, you could think of it like this. In order for this sale to happen, something's going to need to be the case. Namely, that the house inspection, the home inspection, is going to go just well. And of course, if you think about it, that means the opposite of these things would be necessary. Wouldn't it be great if our contract on this building was necessary and not contingent? That is to say, if somebody gave us a contract that was necessary, they were going to have to buy our building. Just like it would have been really cool if it was going to be necessary that they bought the house. Another way to think of it is it doesn't depend on anything. It's just independent. So it doesn't rely on anything else to take place. And the opposite of something that may be or may not be is something that must be. It would have been nice if it must have been the case that the first person who put the contract on our house bought it. But turns out it was the second person who did. And this would be someone who needs nothing. All right, that would be the opposite, right, of what it means to need something. All right, so we don't use terms like this, but we get the idea, right? Something contingent versus something necessary. Something that is dependent versus something that is independent. And this is true not only of contracts on a house, it's true of houses, right? I mean, our house was contingent. It relied upon the builders that built it and the materials that it was made from. It was dependent upon those people to do that. It may have been the case that house would never have been built. And it needed other things to happen. It needed builders and materials, as opposed to something that would be necessary, independent, something that must be, and something that needs nothing. And not only is this true of houses, it's true of pretty much everything in our immediate experience. Tomatoes. I know some of you are Cretans and you don't like tomatoes, but those of us who have taste and a proper palate, we love tomatoes. But tomatoes would fall in the category over here of contingent. They depend upon soil and tomato plants and sunshine. It may or may not be the case that a tomato exists. Some of you wish it was the case that they did not, but it could be the case. But it's going to need something for a tomato to exist. You know what else is contingent? Look at this handsome young fellow right here. That's another example of contingency. That is a strikingly handsome baby, don't you think so? I peaked very early. I guess that's what I'm trying to say here. But you know, I'm contingent, right? And what does that mean? Well, it means that I depended on my mom and dad meeting. Had they not met, I would have never existed. It means that I needed something to happen for me to exist. In fact, not only am I contingent in terms of coming into existence, I need a bunch of things to continue existing, like, you know, oxygen and blood and coffee and donuts and things like that. Those are all the crucial things that kind of keep me going as well. So what you can think of is, one more little point here, everything on the left-hand side, you might say, borrows its existence. I borrowed my existence from my mom and dad, just like you borrowed your existence from your mom and dad. I borrow my continued existence from the sun and from oxygen and all those kinds of things like that. I didn't just have it, I had to get it from somebody. Now, is everybody clear with me? Does this make sense to everybody? And everything in reality that exists is either going to be on the left-hand side or the right-hand side of this board, just like every person who is in here. I'm not sure I'm putting this up again, but there you go. You get your extra dose of baby Shane here. All right, now here is the question. Thank you very much, Luke. So here is the question. We know that contingent things exist, right? We're looking at a room full of them right now. The question is, though, why do they exist? Well, maybe we could say maybe they make themselves exist, but I mean, we know that's not true, right? You didn't make yourself exist. A tomato doesn't make itself exist. Stars don't make themselves exist. That would be like saying that I need money and I don't have any, so I'm going to borrow money from myself. Well, there's no money to borrow. And I need existence. I don't have it. I can't borrow it from myself. So contingent things exist, but they can't account for their own existence. Well, maybe we could say this. Maybe contingent things exist just because they borrow existence from other things that are contingent. But that doesn't make any sense. Like, for example, here is me and my mom when I was a newborn. So I just can't help but think if Mom was still alive and she could still do that, that'd be pretty amazing, wouldn't it, right? I mean, like, all-time bench press record here for a woman, okay? But that's one of my favorite pictures of me and my mom. So I could say, well, why do I exist? Well, I exist because of Fran. But that doesn't really answer the question, does it? Because what is the obvious next question? Well, why does Fran exist? Well, you see, I'm never going to be able to answer that question simply by pointing at other things that have to borrow existence from something else. Let me illustrate it like this. Suppose when we got that contract on our house, this couple said, well, we'd love to buy your house, but we don't have any money. But we're going to go to the bank and we're going to borrow some. So the couple goes to bank one. Hey, we need to borrow money. And the bank says, well, I'm so sorry, we don't have any money either. But let's call bank two and we'll borrow money from them. And they call bank two, and bank two says, we don't have any money either, but maybe we can call bank three. What if they call 10 banks, none of which has any money? Is the couple ever going to get money? Because all of those banks are having to borrow money. They don't have it on their own. What if they call 100 banks, all of which have no money but need to borrow it from somebody else? Are they going to ever get the money? No. What if they call, are you ready for this, 1,000 banks, none of which just has any money and must borrow it from somewhere else? Will the couple ever get the house? What if they, now you ready for your mind to be blown? What if they call an infinite number of banks, none of which has any money and has to borrow from somebody else? Will they ever get the money? See, the problem is not the number of the banks, it's the nature of the banks. All of them have to borrow money to pass on to somebody else. Well, the same is true with us as beings that depend on something else to exist. I borrowed my existence from my parents. They borrowed their existence from their parents, and so on. But if everybody has to borrow existence and nobody just has it, is anything going to exist? And the answer is, of course, no. So here's what we have to conclude then. Contingent things can account for their own existence, and they can't ultimately be accounted for by other contingent things. So here's what that leads us to conclude. The only way that contingent things, dependent things, can ultimately be accounted for is because of something that doesn't have to borrow its existence, something that doesn't depend on something else for its existence, something that is independent of anything else for its existence, something that just simply has existence. Now look with me over in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 17, and I want you to see how Paul makes this very same point. Acts chapter 17. When Paul speaks before these pagans in the city of Athens, and I don't mean pagan in a negative sense, I just mean they're not Christians or Jews. They don't believe in the one true God. Here's what Paul says in Acts 17 and verse 24. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. In other words, the only way to explain why it is that there are contingent things, dependent things, things that have to borrow their existence, is if ultimately there is something that exists that is independent, that is necessary, that doesn't have to borrow its existence, but just simply has existence. Such a being who might identify himself in this way in Exodus 3, I am. Now that's the first part of our case for the existence of God. But why would we call this being that is necessary, the necessary ground of all existence, why would we call this being God? Well, let's think about what some of its qualities might be. If something doesn't borrow existence, but just has it, then that means it doesn't come to be or pass away. It just always is, so it's eternal. And if something doesn't have to borrow its existence, here's another characteristic. You ever go to the store and, like, it was my niece Darby's birthday, well, it's like turned into like a birthday month extravaganza here, but we are roughly around the time of her birthday, and I bought her some things for her birthday. But I will tell you what I did not buy her. I did not buy her anything that has to be put together. Why are you laughing, Carl? I mean, here you come here today and you laugh at that. Well, he's got a good reason to laugh at that because I can't put anything together. That's right. The three worst words for me to see on any box are some assembly required. Now, if you see a box that says that, here's what it means. It means that in order for you to have whatever's in that box, you have to have all the parts and someone has to put them together. Well, that is dependent for its existence for sure, right? On parts and on someone to put them together. Well, if this necessary being doesn't depend on anything else for its existence, there can't be parts it depends on, and there can't be someone it depends on to assemble them, so that means it is immaterial. Here's a third thing it means. It means that whatever this is that doesn't need anything else must be so perfect in its existence, it can't possibly improve. It is so perfect in its existence, it's never going to get better and it's never going to get worse. And in that sense, it is unchanging. And then I think there's at least one other thing we could kind of reason out from this. But to illustrate this, I would like to call for a volunteer from the audience. Jackson, why don't you come up here just a second? I want you to think about one other quality of whatever this necessary being must be. When Jackson comes up here, I know that if I took my glasses off and my jacket and tie off, we would look almost indistinguishable. I realize that. But of course, you can distinguish us. Here's the different ways you can distinguish us. How old are you, Jackson?
21.
And he looks like a very young 21, right? And I just turned 52, and I look like, well, let's just not worry about that. But I mean, we could distinguish me on the basis of time. And we can also distinguish each other on the basis of physical matter. I have a lot more of it than he does here, all right? And we could distinguish each other on the basis of abilities. Like, for example, I can play the violin. Can you play the violin?
Cannot.
Okay, and you play the drums, right?
That's true.
And, well, Anybody can play the drums, right? I mean, really, what are we talking about here? And you knew that was going to happen, and he volunteered to come up anyway. So, all right, I'm done with you, so you can move on now. All right. Here is my point. You can distinguish two things if they're made up of matter, or if they can be distinguished by time, or if they have different abilities. But what if something is eternal? And what if something isn't made up of matter? And what if something is perfect? In principle, you couldn't distinguish them. And that's one of the reasons why people who have thought a lot about what these things lead us to believe that whatever this necessary being is, it must be singular. So I ask you, what do you call the eternal, immaterial, unchanging, unique source of all contingent reality? That's God. And if you'll go back with me to the passage I asked you to mark, I want you to look again very carefully at what Paul said in this passage that we can understand about God from what we see in the things that God has made. In Romans 1, Paul says this in verse 19, if you marked it. Verse 19 says, "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown to them." Listen, verse 20, "For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen." Once you begin to think about why is it that there are things that depend on something else to exist, why do those things exist? You realize that ultimately all of these things must borrow their existence from something that doesn't have to borrow existence but just has it. And once you begin to think more carefully about, well, what would that sort of be? Paul says this is exactly what you can come to understand about who God is. Now, I realize there are efforts made, oftentimes by those who are in the field of science, who are atheists, to try to somehow undercut this line of reasoning. For example, there's a very militant atheist named Lawrence Krauss who wrote a book called A Universe from Nothing. So his answer is, contingent realities don't have to have a source of their existence. They just can pop into existence from nothing. And yet when you read the book, he doesn't really mean nothing. He has a theory about how certain fields in quantum physics with the right kind of structures can create a universe, which everybody who has read the book has pointed out that's not nothing. And in the interview he said, well, I'll be the first to say that what I'm describing isn't necessarily nothing. I don't claim to resolve that question. Well, yeah, you do, like on the cover of the book you did. So I think there should be an asterisk, a universe from not necessarily nothing, because that's really what the book basically says. Another very famous physicist, Stephen Hawking, says, well, because there's a law such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. But this is to seriously misunderstand what the laws of science do. Laws of science can describe how one dependent set of circumstances can lead to another set of dependent circumstances, but they don't create either set. Here's an illustration. If I have $25 in my wallet, and Spencer has $25 in his wallet, the laws of math say if Spencer gives me his $25, I will now have $50. Would you do that for me? All right, we'll talk later here after worship, all right? But here's the thing. The laws of mathematics don't make me have $25, and they don't create his $25. They just simply describe what would happen if he gave me his. The laws of physics, like the laws of gravity, can describe, for example, why large particles attract smaller particles. But they don't explain why either particles should ever exist in the first place. This is just to fundamentally misunderstand the purpose of laws of science. What I want you to see is simply this. In order to explain why it is that the world as we know it exists, and why contingent things exist, we have to draw upon some source of existence itself that just simply has existence, that doesn't borrow it. And that leads me to a final observation to make with you this morning about this argument. If such a being exists, it means we literally owe everything to him. Our lives, we owe to him. At the end of this beautiful doxology in Romans 11, Paul says, "For from him and through him and to him are all things." As I said to you at the start of this series last Sunday morning, the intellect is one aspect of our questions, but there's another aspect, and that is our will, our choices, what we desire. And for some people, they may recognize that by reason and logic, you can clearly see there must be an ultimate ground of all reality. But if you acknowledge that, you're also saying, and I owe everything to God. I owe my entire life to God. And there are some people who do not want to accept that and choose to reject God, not ultimately for intellectual reasons, but for moral reasons. I just want you to think carefully, though, about whether that makes sense or not. What Paul is saying here in this book is that we can see from the things that have been made that there must be a maker. We can see from the things that borrow existence, there must be one who has existence. And that one, then, is the one we owe everything to. And he's calling us to himself. But the other side of the equation is this. If this argument is right, then what it means is that God has loved you into existence. And he calls you to himself. And if you are willing to listen to that call and be responsive to that call, we want to help you to come know more about him through his son Jesus. And this morning, if you need to make a decision to respond to the gospel of Jesus and be baptized into him because of your faith in him, so that you can be united with the one from whom and through whom and to whom are all things, why don't you let us know how we can help?